In a small town in Nigeria called Ijebu, two lively twins, Tunde and Aisha, found themselves nestled on the couch of their living room on a Friday night. They were excitedly watching a popular American movie that was rated for people over 18. The thrilling scenes had them completely captivated, and they were too wrapped up in the story to think about the warnings that came with the movie. As the plot thickened and more intense scenes played out, their mother, Mrs. Adeleke, walked into the room. She paused, looking at Tunde and Aisha with a mix of concern and surprise. "What are you two still doing awake at this hour?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Do you know what time it is?" "Just a little longer, Mom," Tunde begged, his eyes glued to the screen. "Yeah, Mommy, this movie is so interesting," Aisha chimed in, her excitement bubbling over. Before Mrs. Adeleke could respond, their father, Mr. Adeleke, strolled in, stretching his arms. "Let them be, honey. They just turned 18 last week. Tomorrow is Saturday and they don't have school," he said with a chuckle. "Thanks, Dad," the twins shouted in unison, grinning from ear to ear. Mrs. Adeleke hesitated, still feeling uneasy. "I really don't think this is appropriate." "Come on, let's not worry too much. They're old enough to handle it," Mr. Adeleke interrupted, gently pulling her toward their bedroom. Reluctantly, she followed, leaving the twins alone in the dim light of the living room. As the movie continued, a particularly steamy scene unfolded, an actress slowly undressing and climbing onto a shirtless actor. Tunde and Aisha exchanged glances, both unsure of what to think. Aisha smirked at Tunde, clearly noticing how absorbed he was in the scene. "Looks like you're really enjoying this, huh?" she teased. Tunde chuckled nervously, but he didn't say anything back. Then, leaning closer, Aisha whispered, "What if we tried something like that?" Tunde's heart raced, and he gazed at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" he stammered. "You know," she said softly, her fingers drawing circles on his arm. A mix of fear and curiosity began to swirl in his mind. "Tunde, wait," he finally said, shaking his head. "This isn't right. We're siblings." "Don't be such a baby. They did it in the movie," she pouted back. Suddenly feeling overwhelmed, Tunde stood up abruptly. "No, Aisha, this is wrong." Without another word, he hurried to his room, leaving Aisha sitting on the couch, her thoughts swirling. The next morning, their parents left for work, leaving Tunde and Aisha home alone. Aisha couldn't shake off the events of the previous night. She was determined to convince Tunde to indulge her curiosity. Later that afternoon, Tunde stepped out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, applying lotion to his skin. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his back. "Aisha, what are you doing?" he exclaimed, startled. "Relax," she whispered, inching closer. "We're twins. We can share everything. Just give in. I promise you'll enjoy it." Tunde hesitated, his heart pounding. "Okay, just this once. And promise me Mom and Dad won't find out." He finally relented. "I promise," Aisha answered, her voice soothing. As Aisha undressed and lay on the bed, Tunde felt a storm of emotions, curiosity battling with doubt. He joined her, and together they began to explore what they had seen in the movie. Unfortunately, their neighbor, Mrs. Ibe, heard the commotion. She knocked on the door and entered, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. "What on earth are you two doing? Don't you know this is wrong?" she exclaimed. Panicking, Tunde quickly leaped off the bed, fumbling to put on his clothes. "It was Aisha's idea. She made me do it," he blurted out, feeling cornered. Mrs. Ibe shook her head, her expression serious. "This is not acceptable. I'm telling your parents about this." After she left, Tunde turned to Aisha, his heart racing. "What have you done? We're going to be in so much trouble. Just calm down. If she tells Mom, we'll say we were just playing a game," Aisha suggested confidently, though Tunde could hear the tremor in her voice. That evening, Mrs. Adeleke returned home early. Before she could settle in, Mrs. Ibe knocked on the door again. "Good evening. I need to talk to you about your children," she said, her tone grave. "What happened?" Mrs. Adeleke asked, her heart sinking. "I caught Tunde and Aisha in a very compromising situation," Mrs. Ibe replied. Mrs. Adeleke gasped, her eyes wide in disbelief. "That's impossible." "Mom, she's lying," Aisha shouted. "We were just playing." "Yes, Mommy. It was all a misunderstanding," Tunde echoed, his voice shaky. Mrs. Adeleke turned to Mrs. Ibe, her face hardening. "You need to leave my house right now. You've overstayed your welcome." Once Mrs. Ibe left, Mrs. Adeleke took a deep breath, turning to her children. "Please tell me the truth. What happened?" "Mom, we were just playing around. She misunderstood," Aisha insisted, shaking her head. Mrs. Adeleke sighed, feeling torn. "You both need to be careful. I don't want rumors spreading about you." Days passed, and the tension in the Adeleke household grew. One afternoon, Aisha felt unwell and rushed to the bathroom. After she vomited, Mrs. Adeleke rushed to her side, alarmed. "What's wrong, Aisha?" "It's nothing, Mom," Aisha replied, trying to downplay her discomfort. "Don't lie to me. I'm taking you to the hospital," Mrs. Adeleke insisted, her voice firm. They drove to the hospital where the doctor ran some tests. The results shocked Mrs. Adeleke. Aisha was pregnant. She could hardly believe her ears. "How did this happen? Who is responsible for this?" Aisha hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. "It was Tunde," she finally admitted, her voice breaking. Mrs. Adeleke felt her heart drop. "What? My own son?" she cried out in disbelief. "How could you let this happen?" Breaking down in tears, Aisha pleaded, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't know what came over me." Mrs. Adeleke was furious but also heartbroken. "You need to go home and face your brother. I want to hear his side of the story." When they returned home, Mrs. Adeleke called Tunde to the living room. "What is going on between you and your sister?" she asked, her voice filled with anger. Tunde, sensing the gravity of the situation, confessed, "It was a mistake, Mom. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Mrs. Adeleke, unable to contain her frustration, raised her voice. "This is unacceptable. You both need to understand the seriousness of your actions." Mr. Adeleke arrived home later that evening and was shocked to learn the truth. He immediately called Tunde downstairs. "What were you thinking?" he asked, his face a mix of anger and disappointment. Before Tunde could explain himself, Mr. Adeleke lost his temper. "I can't believe you would do something like this. You're grounded." He was about to punish Tunde when Mrs. Adeleke stepped in. "Stop! Yelling won't solve anything," she said firmly, holding her husband back. Days turned into weeks, and Aisha's pregnancy progressed. One afternoon, while she was helping her mother with chores, she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her stomach. "Mom, the baby!" she screamed. Mrs. Adeleke rushed her to the hospital, her heart racing. But despite their efforts, Aisha tragically lost her life during childbirth. The family was left shattered, grappling with the consequences of their actions and the choices they made. In the end, the tragedy left the Adeleke family to ponder a difficult question. Who was truly to blame? Was it the parents for not being vigilant enough, or was it the children for their choices? The heart-wrenching event served as a painful reminder of the importance of guidance, understanding, and the consequences that curiosity can bring. As they faced their grief, the Adeleke family knew they needed to come together to heal and learn from this heartbreaking experience, forever changed by the choices they made and the lessons they learned.